Hello everyone! In this session, we are going to talk about neural networks. You might already know that an AI model is something that can make predictions or decisions based on data, but perhaps you're wondering what exactly is a neural network? And how is it different from all the other AI models? By the end of this video, you'll have answers to what is a neural network fundamentally. Why is it called a neural network? Does it have anything to do with our brains? How different architectures like convolutional neural networks or transformers, how they are used for different tasks like image recognition or language processing. To understand these concepts in this video, no math or coding skills are needed. Just bring your curiosity. Neural networks are at the heart of many recent breakthroughs in artificial intelligence. If you have heard of AI models that can recognize faces, translate languages, or even play complex games, chances are they are powered by some kind of neural network. Neural networks are loosely inspired by how neurons or brain cells communicate in a human brain. But keep in mind that this resemblance is more of a metaphor than exactly how it works in the brain. When a neuron in a human brain receives signals from another neuron, it decides in a very simplified sense whether to fire the signal to its neighbors or not. In a neural network in a computer, we have something similar going on. Each artificial neuron or node takes in numbers from other nodes and it applies some simple math to those numbers and then it outputs a new number to the next set of nodes. These neurons are arranged in layers in a network to help them gradually refine this information and make a prediction. Think of each neuron as a tiny decision maker, which processes incoming information and passes along what it thinks is important to the next set of neurons. By stacking many of these neurons and letting them talk to each other, the network can learn complex patterns, like recognizing a cat's face in a photo or spotting grammatical structures in a sentence. If you simply Google the word neural network, you might come across something that looks like this. This is a good example of a very basic neural network. But is this in any way related to the neural networks that we are using for processing images or language? It turns out that those neural networks are much more complex than what you're seeing here. However, it's a good idea to get started with this neural network. Think about a neuron as a brick of a large building. You can stack these bricks in several different ways and create really cool architectures. The most straightforward way to stack these bricks is just on top of each other. And you have layers of these and you create a wall. So what you're seeing here is something like that. We have layers of neurons, but instead of stacking them on top of each other, they're typically represented left to right. The first layer is called the input layer. The last layer is called the output layer. And everything in between is called a hidden layer. Each layer can have any number of neurons. The number of neurons in your input layer is typically determined by the type of data that you intend to train the network with. The number of neurons in the output layer is typically determined by the type of prediction you want to make. Everything in between is Wild West. Do whatever you want. However, empirically, by conducting many experiments over several different types of data sets, researchers have figured out the rough structure that seems to work in most cases. For example, for a very straightforward classification or a regression task where you have numerical values coming in and perhaps a numerical value comes out as an output, the number of neurons that are in the hidden layers is typically less than the number of neurons that are in the input layer. Also, it's best to not go beyond 2 or 3 hidden layers for this type of stacking that you're seeing here. If you have watched the video, what is an AI model? A natural next question is, where are the numbers or parameters that are associated with this architecture? This is a really important point. These parameters are not explicitly shown in the architectural diagrams of neural networks, typically just to keep it simple. However, each connection that you're seeing here between any 2 neurons is associated with a model parameter. You can call them model weights, model parameters, or coefficients, weights, etc. These are the unknown values that are associated with the model. There are so many interesting ways in which these neurons can be connected, which lead to different model architectures. Let's look at a few common architectures. First one is convolutional neural networks, known as CNN. These neural networks are good with visual data or images. They're good with tasks like identifying objects in an image, like faces or cats or dogs, any object. Or perhaps identifying things in a medical scan, like an MRI image. Is there a tumor in this image? Segmenting it out, things like that. They use special layers to accomplish this, and the name of those special layers is convolutional layers. These layers are like filters that scan across the image to find edges or corners, shapes in the image, even textures, for example. And then they identify how all of these different shapes and textures come together to form an object. So that's one type of neural network. The other type is recurrent neural networks. Recurrent neural networks are good with sequential data, like predicting the next word in a sentence or analyzing time series data, stock prices, for example. They have loops in the architecture of the network that allow them to keep track of what the previous input was, using the information of what the previous values were, they are able to forecast or predict what the next value should be. This makes them well suited for sequences. Another very popular architecture is transformers. Transformers are good with language-related tasks. And increasingly, they are also being applied to images and other data types. They process all the words or tokens, popularly known as tokens, which are the smallest unit that the neural network understands in language. So typically, they process these in parallel and learn which words relate to which. So they capture the context. This architecture powers many modern language models that can translate text, that can create human-like sentences, and talk to you almost like a human. I'm sure you're familiar with a bunch of them. They have been really, really popular. The last architecture that I want to talk about is feed-forward neural networks. They're also popularly called multi-layer perceptrons. These neural networks are good at general purpose problems like basic classification or regression. Information flows in one direction, forward from the input layer through the hidden layers and finally to the output layer. There are no loops, There are no special filters like convolution or anything like that. It's very straightforward. So each type of architecture is like a different tool in a toolbox. You pick the best one suited for the job in hand. So let's talk about how do these neural networks learn the unknown values or the model parameters that are associated with them. Does each neural network learn differently based on its architecture? It turns out that all the neural networks out there, no matter what their architecture is, learn exactly the same way. They use something called gradient descent to figure out what the model parameters are supposed to be to get optimal performance for a given data set. So the first step is, of course, to collect a ton of data. Let's say like thousands of images, let's say of cats and dogs. So you label thousands of images as either being a cat image or a dog image, and then you give this to the neural network. So you tell the neural network that here are a few images and here are the predictions that you should ideally be making. So the neural network looks at this data and starts with a random initialization of the model parameter values. It's of course going to be making a ton of mispredictions because it has started with random numbers. So here's what happens after that. The network compares its guesses with the right labels, the correct answers, and it calculates how off it is. This is measured by something called a loss function. So it's essentially a measure of how many mistakes the neural network is making in making those predictions. Next step is to nudge the weights in such a way that the error decreases. Now the question is, how do you know what the right way to nudge them is? This is where gradient descent comes in. At a high level, gradient descent tells you what direction to nudge each of these model weights in the neural network so that the overall performance of the model improves. It does this by calculating the partial differentials with respect to each model weight as the error is propagated backwards. However, we are not going to go into the details of that process in this video. Let's just assume that there is a mathematical way of figuring out how to nudge these model weights such that the performance of the model improves. So this process of nudging the model weights in some direction, either a positive direction or a negative direction, this happens over many iterations. So you do this many times across several iterations. You keep doing this till you're satisfied with the model's performance. In this example, for example, if the model is predicting a cat or a dog pretty well on most of the images, then you can stop. This process is essentially the same for all network types, whether you're dealing with CNNs, transformers, or any other type of architecture. So if we do this, are we guaranteed to have a model that performs well? Well, there are no guarantees. It's possible that you keep iterating like thousands of times and the model has still not learned anything from the data and it keeps mispredicting. It can happen. So you'll reinitialize the model to a completely different random weights and try it again. And in a couple of trials, it's possible that you'll arrive at a certain initialization which is helping your model converge. It is also possible that no matter what you do, the model doesn't converge, which means the architecture of the model is unable to capture the patterns in the data that will help it to make the right predictions. And you perhaps have to try a new architecture. So why do we have so many different architectures or so many different types of neural networks? That's because the data type matters. An image is structured differently compared to text. An image is a two-dimensional grid of pixels, while text is a sequence of words. Different network architectures exploit these inherent structures effectively. And then there is also task complexity, right? Some tasks require a certain type of architecture in order to do a good job, while other tasks are perhaps a little bit simpler and a simpler architecture would do for them. Researchers constantly experiment with new architectures to come up with things that are computationally efficient, that are better at capturing patterns from the dataset, etc. Understanding which type of neural network suits a given problem is crucial. It's just like choosing the right tool for a job. For example, you wouldn't rent the most powerful hardware tool that is there in a shop if all you needed was a simple hammer, right? So similarly, you don't always need like a massive language model with billions of parameters when a very straightforward multi-layer perceptron is able to solve the task that you have. So to sum it up, a neural network is essentially a bunch of artificial neurons that are arranged in layers. It's loosely inspired by how human brains process information, but it's of course implemented in code and math, and they're capable of learning complex patterns by adjusting internal model weights or parameters based on the training data. They're found in many forms: CNNs, RNNs, transformers, etc. Each of these is specialized for a different type of task. So that's it. A neural network is just a layered system of tiny decision makers that pass numbers around and learn from data. By tweaking how these layers are arranged, we can come up with several different types of architectures that excel at tasks from recognizing cats in an image to translating entire paragraphs of text. Whether you're curious about the buzzwords like CNNs or transformers, or just interested in how AI models think, understanding the basic concept of neural networks opens the door to the fascinating world of machine learning. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope now you have a clearer picture of what neural networks are all about. Stay curious, and I'll see you next time.